All right, today we are going to be talking all about spring perfect eyeshadow palettes. I'm going to be showing some newer and some older palettes side by side with a tutorial of each palette. And I like to say this every time I do any type of seasonal video. Of course, you can wear any color, any season, but sometimes it is fun to get into the mood and the vibe of the season. I've been having a lot of fun experimenting with my eyeshadow these days. And I hope that even if you're not in the market to get any of these palettes, that you'll be inspired to dig into your own collection. I'm also really excited to talk about these palettes in general because I think we've got some great ones here. And I do have a discount affiliate code with several of the brands, so I'm going to pop it up on the screen now and it'll be down in the description box. Alright, starting off with a new release from Fantasy Cosmetica, we have the Cleric palette. Fantasy Cosmetica is a small indie brand and they make a lot of fantasy themed palettes, as the name would imply. This brand has been around for, I want to say we're coming up on the 5th year. And I gotta tell you, they have come such a far way when it comes to the quality of their products, which is saying a lot because they started off on a good foot to begin with. They do a lot of these kind of capsule 9-pan color stories, which I love because I do love a good curated small palette. This one I would venture to say is one of my favorite 9-pan color stories. You've got some really sparkly shimmers, including a beautiful blue-brown duochrome, a kind of silvery topper-like shimmer, some blue tones, some grungy green tones. And when it comes to the mattes, I really like that we have a good range from light mattes to deep mattes. In general, when I have palettes that have both mattes and shimmers, I do tend to prefer that they have sort of a matte heavy ratio, but honestly, I really enjoy this color story, so I don't mind. And the other thing to keep in mind about these palettes is that they are fully magnetic, so if you do want to swap out a shade, you can. For example, I think for me personally, I'm probably going to swap out that white for a light blue. I gotta say, I really find this color story inspiring. I feel like these shades go together so well that you can use most of them in only one look if you want to. But these shimmers would all make really beautiful one and done shades as well. In terms of the mattes, I found them all to perform well. They have a buildable formula. Even the dark navy, which I feel like that type of shade can be hard to do well, I found it to perform nicely in the 2 looks that I created. Okay, the next palette we have is somewhat of an oldie but a goodie from Cosmic Beauty. This is the Lovers palette, and it came out around Valentine's Day last year. I think it's a beautiful palette for going into spring. Again, I love the range of light mattes to deep mattes. I love that we get some pastels in here, some deep kind of grungy murky tones, and then some very deep and dramatic mattes, that blue, that purple, that black matte. I have talked about Cosmic Beauty a whole lot of times on my channel, and that is because I really do love the formula. I love the price point. The mattes I find to be extremely buildable and blendable and what I would consider to be beginner friendly. And the shimmers have just continued to step up in their game from year to year. This palette in particular, I felt like had some very standout multi-chromes, but even with the non-chrome shimmers, they are extremely sparkly. Something to keep in mind is that a lot of people have told me that because they're not UK based, the shipping is obviously something to keep in mind when you're factoring in price. Of course, you can use the discount codes. I have heard that people, when they're making a purchase from the brand, they may try to get more than one palette at a time. This palette in particular also pairs really well with the 12-pan palette that just came out from the brand. And that palette is called Angelic. I did a whole video on that palette and I did some comparisons in that video. I'm going to link it in the cards. By and large, most of the people who have tried Cosmic Beauty have told me that they have really enjoyed the palettes. And honestly, that makes me so happy to hear because they really are one of my favorite indie brands. And while their blue leaning palettes are the ones that are my own personal favorites, I feel like this is the palette I would recommend as being perfect for going into spring. Okay, the next palette I have is the Pocket Spring palette from Cloudicos, and this is another brand that I have talked about many, many times on my channel. I love their little kind of small, compact, all shimmer palettes. I absolutely love traveling with these. I love how small they are, but how much punch they pack. These palettes took so long for the brand owner to do. I know that the series was spread out over several years, and honestly, that is because I just feel like there was so much thought that was put into the curation of each one. As you can see when I'm swatching each shimmer, you have a really nice variety. You've got an iridescent, you've got holographic, you have duochromes, straight shimmers. I do want to make mention that there is a very flaky shade in here, and this shade was extremely polarizing. Apparently, there were people that really, really loved this shade, and also some people that really kind of hated it. So that flaky shade has since been swapped out. I really love that the owner kind of took that feedback and implemented it. I also forgot to mention, this is an Australian-based indie brand, and it's actually really cool. If you live in Australia, they actually have a store now. I believe it's based in Sydney. Now, Pocket Winter is my own personal favorite palette because I love the blues in it and the icy tones, but I think that Pocket Spring is absolutely perfect for spring. The palette lends itself to all shimmer looks. You can use them as one and done shades or layer them over mattes. That's exactly what I did in the look that I shared here. Another thing I really love about the Cloudicose palettes is that there's always so much look inspo that you can get from the Instagram page. So if you're curious for some inspo, definitely make sure to check out that page. All right, the next palette we have is from Terra Moons, and this is in collaboration with Ellie Starr. This is the second part of their collab. The first part actually came out at the end of last year, and I gotta say, this is my kind of color story. I thought the other palette was pretty, but this one is definitely more me. I love the blue tones. I love a neon green. How often do we get a neon in a palette? And I gotta say, the Terra Moons neon mattes are really nice. As usual, you can really expect that the shimmers will sparkle and shine. And as you might be able to guess, I love that we get a couple of iridescents in here because they're such versatile shades. I love being able to use them as highlighters as well. The texture of these shimmers are overall pretty smooth. There is one that's a little bit flakier, that's the blue iridescent, but it definitely does smooth out with your finger. And Terra Moons does hand make a lot of their single shadows. The palette is one of their machine-made ones. I think the machine pressed mattes I actually prefer, and these shimmers, like I said, are really nice. I don't feel like the quality is compromised. There really isn't much I would change about the palette. I might have put one more lighter matte in here because we have a bunch of deeper ones. But even without that change, I think this is a beautiful palette. All of the shades in here are magnetic, so you can move them around, swap them out. I find the tones in here to be incredibly harmonious, and because it's a smaller palette, I feel like you can incorporate a lot of them into one look. I think this palette and Ophiuchus are my two favorites from the brand. And personally, Ophiuchus would also be a really great spring palette. Okay, the next palette I have is called Woeful Whimsy, and this is a brand new palette that came out from Unearthly. It's in collaboration with Andromeda. I do consider Andromeda to be a friend, so there is that bias there when I'm talking about the palette. This to me feels like an incredibly unexpected color story. I honestly have never seen a color story quite like it. I'm not gonna lie, I felt intimidated of this color story the first time I saw it. But I think these tones really actually pair very well together. And of course, you can just use one matte at a time if you don't want to incorporate all of those colors. Personally, I really enjoy trying to create a look with as many of these shades as possible. I gotta say, for the past couple of years, I have really enjoyed the formula of the Unearthly palettes. These shimmers have just gotten progressively more sparkly over time. I find the mattes to be very easy to work with. So in terms of the formula, I feel like if you know the Unearthly formula, this palette is definitely on par with the formulas of their other palettes. The palette has 4 shimmers, and while that may not be too many, they're very versatile because you get 2 that are iridescent. I love that we have a blue-brown duochrome in here, and you also get a holographic shade. The price point of the palette is under $50, and I feel like for an indie palette that has some special shimmers, that is a very fair price point. Also, I'm loving that this is another palette where we have a neon green. And I know that Andromeda absolutely adores green, so I'm not at all surprised by that. I think they did a beautiful job with this palette, and it's even more beautiful in person. Also, I want to mention that because the texture of these shimmers is quite smooth, that the iridescents make for beautiful face highlights as well. Alright, the next palette we have is from Diveroon, and this is Silver and Cold. I think it's a perfect color story for winter going into spring because you've got some cooler tones and you also have some pastels. You've got some icy shimmers and you've also got some pastel shimmers. And there's also an iridescent in here, which is absolutely standout. Before I get too far into talking about this palette, I do want to mention I did a whole video on this collection that I will link in the cards. And I try on almost everything in the collection in that video. Now, something that you can always expect when it comes to a Diveroon palette is that the shimmers are going to be standout. Of course, that is honestly true of all of the indie palettes, but with Diveroon, I feel like they are almost on another level in terms of the impact that you get from them. This palette was absolutely no exception. True to the name of the palette, you get lots of icy tones, cool tone metallics. I like the incorporation of the pastel tones as well, even in the shimmers. A few of the shimmers do look a little bit close. That's the only comment that I have about them. But even then, I do feel like there are a fair bit of differences. The mattes are also very pigmented, buildable, blendable, all of the things that I enjoy about matte shadows. And I just found this palette to be such a delight to work with. This is another one where I was a little bit intimidated of this color story just in terms of not really knowing where I was going to go. But once I started playing with it, all of these tones are so harmonious that it makes it easy to put a look together. It probably goes without saying, but of course you have to like cool tones, really like cool tones to like this palette. If you do, and if you really enjoy an impactful shimmer, I don't think you're going to be disappointed by this palette. Only thing I would have changed, as I mentioned earlier, is that a couple of the shimmers are a little bit close. I might have changed 1 or 2 of them around, but that's just me being nitpicky. All right, next we have a palette from Singe Beauty, and this is actually the first time that I am sharing some detailed thoughts about the brand. I can say wholeheartedly that this is my favorite color story that Singe has done. I feel very inspired by this one. I love that we have a periwinkle in here and we have some beautiful kind of pink tones, some green tones. I know that the owner, Andromeda, cares about a lot of the same things that I do when it comes to the components of a color story in particular. I know that she also really appreciates having light mattes, having very deep mattes. Another thing she mentions is that she likes her shimmers to have impact but not be the kind that will crease, and likes the mattes to be buildable. And I gotta say, of all of the palettes that I'm talking about in terms of being beginner friendly, when it comes to a colorful palette, this palette is definitely the one that I feel like is the most beginner friendly. And I say that because I found the mattes to be incredibly buildable. But even the shades that are typically, a little bit of a challenge to work with, like a periwinkle matte, it didn't have any issues whatsoever. And the exact same with the very deep mattes. In the look that I'm sharing, when I used the magenta matte, I used a lighter matte to blend out around the edges, but honestly, I really didn't have to. I feel like that is how seamless it blended, even without a transition shade. Another thing that Andromeda has talked about is wanting the price point of her palettes to be fair, especially in the setting of palettes that can really creep up there in price. So we end up seeing a lot of really sparkly shimmers, maybe not the shiftiest chromes, but as you can see, these shimmers are very special. And you have a holographic, you have an iridescent. These shimmers are going to look special on the lid, and they're also the type that will be approachable to a wide variety of skin types and eye shapes. The next palette we have is from Starborn Cosmetics. This was made by Millie Bad to the Brow. This is Nascent, which is the first palette from the brand. And I think this is a great palette for going into spring. I would describe this as a dark spring palette. You get some moody, murky tones, and you have a couple of pops of bright shades as well. And it's fun because this palette was actually inspired by one of the BYOPs that Millie did. I believe it was last year or maybe a couple of years ago. I've been watching Millie's videos for years, so I have a general idea about the types of formulas that she likes, which actually have a fair bit of overlap with Angelica, particularly when it comes to the shimmers and wanting to have shimmers that are going to work for a wide variety of skin types and eye shapes, because I know that Millie has talked about having hooded lids. Because this palette is so matte heavy and we have 4 shimmers, the price point of the palette was able to be kept down because the shimmers that are in here all have a sort of semi-sheer base. They're all extremely versatile. So you can totally get a lot of different uses for them based on like how you layer them and how you pair them with one another. Again, in terms of my experience with the mattes, I found them to be easy to use. I wasn't surprised by that because I feel like Millie also prefers a kind of more buildable formula and the type that you don't get too much kick up or fallout as you're using. This palette came out at the very beginning of 2026, and I think it's a perfect color story for going into spring. Next palette we have is from Lethal Cosmetics, and this was their most recent palette release. This is the SpongeBob palette. This color story is really fun. I love that you have the bright pops, you have lots of green tones. In general, I feel like Lethal has some of the best collabs, even when it comes to the details, like the packaging, the theming. None of that was an exception when it came to this collection. I will say my favorite part about this palette is the color story. I think the formula in this palette is solid, but it's not my favorite. It does feel like for this palette, there was a bit of a formula change. Don't get me wrong, the shimmers in here are still special. The mattes are still pretty good, but I didn't find them to be as consistent as the Dexter collaboration. Again, don't get me wrong, this is a beautiful color story and it is perfect for going into spring. But I do have to mention it, especially if you're someone who may be trying them for the first time or is familiar with some of their other collections. I do wonder if part of that is that, you know, the shades that were maybe a little bit harder to work with, like the neon green or the cobalt blue, like those tones are harder to formulate just in general. But I love the color story so much that even though it's not my favorite formula from Lethal, I still had so much fun using it in some looks. And some of you may have noticed they've actually started sneak peeking their next collection. It looks like it has some moody tones and some bright tones from the initial sneak peek. This palette is definitely giving me tropical fish vibes, and I mean that in the best way. Next palette we have is from Touch of Glam Beauty. It's been quite a while since I have tried a palette from Touch of Glam, so I was really excited about that. Touch of Glam is particularly known for their single shadows, especially their holographic shadows, but honestly, I feel like they've become known for a lot of their other shimmer shadows as well. And I feel like what's special about this palette is the fact that you get a whole bunch of shades for a lower price point than it would be to buy a bunch of singles from Touch of Glam. So if you're curious about trying a bunch of the formulas, I feel like this could be a good way. It retails for $62, which is pricey, but you get 8 shimmers and 2 mattes, so definitely very, very shimmer heavy. You got some holographic shades, some metallic shades, some semi-sheer ones, an overall great variety, and all of them super high impact. As I previously mentioned, when I have palettes with mattes and shimmers, I do tend to prefer a matte heavy palette, but I feel like in this case, where you're getting to try all of these formulas for Touch of Glam, I don't mind it as much as I would in other contexts. The color story itself, I would say, isn't my favorite color story, but this palette I personally would use more as sort of a collection of special single shadows. And I gotta say, the formula of Touch of Glam mattes is very nice. And you have two very beautiful bright mattes in here, and the tones of these shades are definitely harder to come by in my opinion, especially that kind of bright neon pink. That is the type of tone that is hard to formulate. All right, and the final palette I'm going to talk about in today's video is one that came out last fall. This is Dark Dreamscape from Beaute Bar. And as I mentioned, this palette came out last year. It was around the fall time, I want to say. But honestly, I think that this color story is perfect for going into spring, especially with those pastel tones. I do like that you have some deeper mattes. I think I mentioned when I made a video on this palette, the main thing I would have changed is that I would have loved to see a few more deeper mattes. But even without those changes, I feel like this color story is one of my own personal favorites from the brand. And I do feel like that's saying a lot because this is a bigger palette than I tend to want to go for. The color story is a lot of fun. I like that you have some cool tones and some warm tones, of course, light mattes and deep mattes, and very special shimmers. Another thing that we can really expect to see with palettes from Beaute Bar. It is the specialness of the shimmers that kind of causes some of the Beaute Bar palettes to be a little bit more on the pricey side. But this is another brand that I feel like makes some of my favorite indie palettes overall. I always tend to get pretty excited for their releases. In this palette, you get a lot of very special shimmers. You have some chrome shades, you've got some semi-sheer shades, and even a deeper, kind of more moody shimmer. I particularly like the pop of orange in this one. I feel like the color story for me just wouldn't be the same without it. Also, I think I forgot to mention, but this palette was just restocked after being out of stock for quite a while. So in case it was on your wish list, it's back now. As you can see from the swatches, you can really tell that there doesn't feel like there's any duplicative shades. And I really love to see that, especially when the palette is on the bigger side. All right, now that I've had a chance to go through everything, I would love to know what you think of these palettes I shared. Have you tried any of them? Are any on your wish list? Or have you tried anything from these brands in general? Full disclosure, I had wanted to get this video up a little bit earlier, but because I wanted to do tutorials with them, it definitely took me longer than I wanted. I did have a few other palettes I wanted to include in this video, but I'm gonna end up making a separate video for those newer palettes. So I do hope it was worth the wait. As always, I hope you found this video helpful. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.